Good. Okay. Peter, there were a few questions that came through, and as is normal, I haven't uploaded them all yet, so I'm just doing that now. Is there anyone there that you can deal with that I don't need a to comment on?
So what's the best method to secure a root barrier around surfaces that necessitates perforations in the barrier?
So what's the best way to secure a root barrier?
This is from Peter Hannigan.
Sean, I think your mic's on, mate.
Yep, Sean. Thanks. Yeah, that works.
That works.
What's the best way to secure a root barrier? Was that the question?
What is the best method to secure a root barrier around surfaces that necessitate perforations in the barrier? So how do you seal it, I guess?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Roots don't behave.
Peter here now.
And root barriers aren't overly effective. They're somewhat effective, but they're not overly effective. Depending on the tree you're dealing with, I've seen fig roots go right up over the barrier, back across, bamboo go under and up. So barriers aren't perfect. That's the first thing. Follow the manufacturer's instructions. There was work, Peter, done on a product called Casseron G by the National Botanic Gardens in Canberra. Now, I won't tell you to use that because the instructions say it's a pre-emergent herbicide, but you can read how they use that to create a chemical barrier to stop roots. And that something like that may or may not be approved. You'll have to do the research to place that around the surfaces, and that kills the roots under contact chemically. So that's one option that's available. You know, it's such a difficult process dealing with any breach to the barrier. And I think you've just got to accept that nothing's perfect. I mean, if someone's expecting never to have root problems again because they put a barrier in, then they need to move to Broken Hill. Okay.
Would copper do the same thing? Copper
no, it doesn't. I tried it. I experimented with it. It's not sufficient enough to cause a problem. So I used copper mesh. Hang on a second. I've still got some in the office. So I used fine mesh like this, and it did nothing in deterring it. I use a coarser mesh. And this sounds really crazy. I've got one species of tree, a Cassia mora, that absolutely is a wonderful snail attractant. And so I use this around the base of the Cassia mora, and it stops the snails from climbing up, or it deters them sufficiently enough that they don't become a problem. So, but not much good for roots. And yes, copper is toxic, but it's toxic. It's phytotoxic to living cells. And so, you know, you put a big sheet of that in, you may get deflection of the roots, but eventually they're just going to push against it because the outside of a root is bark, and that outer bark is going to be largely dead material in time for most species. And it's odd when you look at the bark compared with the above ground part, you see, you know, Crimbia maculata will be shedding its bark, but the roots won't be. And the reason the roots won't be is they can't. So you end up with this slothing of dead material on the outside that means they can push against things. My local suburb, to me, Ropes Crossing, they deep planted all the Crimbia maculatas in root barricades, and you can see where the root barricades have been slowly pushed out of the ground by the secondary growth of the roots and the buttress, which is really wonderful to see. So if you want to see pictures of that, I can grab some for you and show you. It's a great example of experimenting with things and things going well, but not the way you plan them to go. So a really great experiment. And I think I've mentioned that before, you know, deep planting may not be as bad as we think. Many species seem to cope with it really well. In fact, many species seem to prefer it, particularly rainforest and riparian species. But Crimbia maculata is a dry region tree, dry woodlands, and it's doing well in that environment. Okay, so that answers that one for you, Peter. Next.
Vicky's got a question about, my question is about roots coping with a level spreader being constructed over them. The structure's piers
I've got the one.
based. Yeah, got that one.
Yep. My question's roots coping with a level spreader being constructed over them. The answer is yes. That they don't care about something being constructed over them, even in direct contact. They'll flatten out and distort, and you'll see the root become a flat root. And I've showed you pictures of that before. The problem whenever I've specified these things, Vicky, and something to keep in mind is you've got to talk about the level of the invert of the beam that they're putting over. There's nothing like saying, look, I want a suspended beam and finding that the invert's 300 mils below ground. So you've got to communicate that you want the underside of that beam to be sitting on the ground or above the ground.
Yeah, that's what they've said. But should I specify something lightweight to filter the water instead of just normal rocks and things?
Nah, it'll be fine.
Yeah, they're going to use concrete sleepers horizontally resting on the ground, but obviously there'll be piers every so often between the roots.
Yeah, look, you're going to have some root loss, and that's just a normal part of construction. And I mean, by now you'd have seen that lots of trees seem to cope quite well. My view is it takes a concerted effort to kill trees on a development site. It's not just one mistake, you know.
Yeah.
In pier hole, it's pier hole, then washing out the concrete, then parking the cars, then concreting over the top of it. That sort of level is the sort of problem that you get that causes it, Vicky. But look, things like the concrete pavement that you're talking about, concrete's porous, and that concrete will be possibly 32, likely 25 MPa. It lets a reasonable amount of water through. People get surprised at how much does go through concrete.
The concrete sleepers.
Yeah.
Okay.
All concrete's porous. That's why we have to line the inside of swimming pools to stop them from leaking.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah, that answers my question.
Excellent. Next one, Peter.
Yeah, there was one about now I can't find it, about branches.
Okay, let me just that's come the last 2 days. Yep, that's fine. I'm just going to search for Peter and I'll see what I've got from you. It'll just take a little time. I'm one of those horrible people that has a far too large Outlook file than I should have. In the absence of published literature, how do you justify backup statements that post the failure of a codominant stem, the remaining stem will be unlikely to fail, and the fact that the tree is not lopsided to the point of failure, post stem failure?
That's the one.
Yep, that's Peter Hannigan again. Peter, I've got some photographs from Duncan Slater of a tree where he's pulled out a codominant stem, made it fail, and let it grow back. I've got photographs of trees that have grown back. So that's the first thing I use, photographic evidence. Second of all, the root system is far stronger than taking off half the branches on one side of a tree, causing it to fall over. If it did, there'd be power line clearance when they're putting in new power lines. And I remember doing this many years ago where we came up and removed one half of the tree to put wires past. The trees would fall over everywhere. They don't. No one can show me examples of 20 trees in a row that have been pruned on one side and fallen over. And the last thing I say to people fairly regularly is just think about a branch for a moment. It's horizontal, okay, and it's not failing. So all that load is horizontal. It doesn't fail. Why am I worried about something that's upright with a small torsional load? And it is a relatively small torsional load.
Yeah, I've got no problems with that principle. It was just people are looking for references when you make those statements. So it's one you've just got to revert to experience.
Yeah, and one where you say, look, that's interesting. Can you show me any papers that go the other way?
Yeah.
I mean, you're looking at an extrapolation of a concept that may be entirely wrong. You're saying that if I lost half the tree, well, you know, I've got lots of half trees that they put buildings beside that haven't fallen over. So, you know, at what point do I start to worry about it? And, you know, you're always going to have somebody that feels otherwise. And I think a part of that problem, Peter, is we're dealing with, without you taking it the wrong way, a relatively young industry. And, you know, where I'm considered to be an old fogey, and most of the arborists that are out there today consulting are probably less than 20 years experience. And a lot of them have never had real experience in, well, what happens if?
Yeah.
But I do see trees where they're putting in new transmission wires that's about as bad as you can get, and the trees are still standing upright. So if it were a concern, we'd see that is a repeat issue.
Yeah. Okay. Happy with that.
Okay. And then what benchmark is there for a branch being overextended? It seems to appear regularly now in reports and TPOs. Where is it coming from? It's coming from, again, this logical extrapolation that's erroneous. Okay. There is no data that shows otherwise, but there is data that shows us now that overextended branches are no more likely to fail than normal branches. So, and that's in cyclonic conditions. Now, admittedly, it was a limited study out of Florida, but it's still, that's what the data showed.
Was that the Brian Keane one?
Yeah. Rich Howard, a group of them that co-jointly publish a lot of papers. And I mean, let's really be honest, is if that branch was long and overextended, it was long and overextended the year beforehand proportionally, and long and overextended the year beforehand proportionally, and it will continue to be long and overextended for another 40 or 50 years. And then that branch finally drops off because the tree says, well, I don't want you anymore, or whatever. And then someone says, see, I told you it happens. And that's just...
So is it just me, or are other people just seeing the prevalence of that statement?
Oh, no, it's been going on for ages. And look, there are people that have publications, there are people that have documents that talk, you know, what does the ISA say, and it's BMP, and, you know, what do our publications within ARBOS say? And a lot of these things are written based on these mental traditions. Traditions where we say that, you know, like, why are we 12 times trunk diameter away from the base of a tree when transplanting is usually done 5 times trunk diameter from the center of the tree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, like, where did that extra amount come from? And the answer is, well, in an ideal world, in a perfect world, we would be 12 times. In fact, Benson will argue that ideally we should be 15 times. And in a perfect world, that's what we'd do. In a perfect world, we would have stopped the population of Australia at about 300,000 or 400,000. And the rest of you can go get stuffed. I'm going to get myself a decent sized property on the harbour eventually. You know, the reality is that's not real world. Real world, what the question we're asked to answer is, how do I retain a tree and allow the development to go ahead to get an appropriate yield in the situation within the planning law? That's the question that's asked of us that we need to answer. In terms of your risk, I've come to the view that there's very few things that I would be worried about from a risk perspective that aren't so obvious that an 8-year-old would be asking questions. Now, I'm using an 8-year-old figuratively, not literally, but they're things that are so, you know, the tree's already splitting, the tree's rocking in the ground, the tree's dead, the tree's creaking and groaning and bits are starting to crack. There are vertical splits up the tree. And even then, you know, I've just been over in Western Australia. I'm going to go back over and catch up with Peter in a week or so's time. The agonists there have in their sinuses just massive amounts of separation and decay. And I look at them and think, why don't you fail? And the answer is they don't fail. So I don't need to ask why.
Yeah.
We talk about cavities and we say, oh, look, cavities. I'm worried about cavities. And then I thought about it. Well, how about what they call the strangler figs that make ladder trees that are hollow on the inside have got 5% wall thickness and big sections missing out of them that you can climb up, why aren't they failing?
Makes
And
sense.
part of the reason they're putting the tissue further out, and if you put tissue further out, it becomes stronger. Tree statics, and statics has its people that contest its accuracy and scientific validity, and that's fine. It's still got some merit to it, regardless of which way you go. And the general view, for example, on Quercus robur, you need a wall thickness of 4 centimeters. Now, I do have somewhere or other on my desk a metal ruler. 4 centimeters, yeah, here it is. 4 centimeters wall thickness, that thick. Now, I can see arborists that went through TAFE the same time as you. I can see arborists that went through 20, 30, 40 years ago running around screaming, saying, hell no, that's going to kill you. And the dumbest thing is, I remember going out on meter diameter trees and cutting, 6 centimeter wall thicknesses with a cavity cleaner, cleaning out and filling it with polyurethane, and they weren't failing. Now, it's not saying they can't, but the converse is not true. Just because some do doesn't mean they all do, because I see after a storm, I see perfectly normal trees that have failed. Things that I look at and I say, I got no idea. I see branches that aren't overextended fail, and I say, damn it, why? And often there's a previous transverse fracture, as you know, and it's just one of those things that happens. A tree doesn't care, but loses the occasional limb every now and again, as much as other people do. It can't be a problem, because if it was, we'd have a lot more funerals. So, published out in the same groups, branches similar size to the stem, so equal proportionate. Clustered branches have been published out. Included bark is published out, Slater, and then the same group out of Florida, unless it's actively cracking. And there's 2 forms of that. One's the pursed lips, the tight inverted V at the margins of the inclusions, the outside edge, and the other ones are when you can actually pass the credit card and swipe it. But apart from that, there seem to be no more likely to fail. And you've seen them, Peter, and I know we all have here, where you go past a tree, it's had a codominant stem, it's failed in a severe wind event, and it's halted, and it just sits there like that for decades.
Yep.
And there's some good ones out at the college campus that fit into exactly that category. So I think you saw them 15 years after the failure started, and Sean wanted to cut one of them down, and I got cranky with him about it. Is that not right, Sean? You can just nod. I can't hear you. You can't defend yourself. Okay. Well, any other questions quickly from the floor? Otherwise, I'm going to have a look at the TCAA system and just give you an idea on how that's working. So in the absence of other questions, let me share my screen. No, I think I can't. I like to share all my screen. Screen, yes, share. I know it will cause problems. Share. Okay, I've done this as a PowerPoint presentation, just so that I represent things accurately. Some of my opinions may not be so accurate, but at least I'm not wanting to misrepresent what's there. So you can all see that. That's great. So we're looking at analysis of the tree management guidelines for facilities management and schools. This is the TCAA's general approach to risk assessment. It's included in the document, and it just talks about, in my mind, it demonstrates well some of the problems we have with risk assessment, some of the things you need to keep an eye out for. It's got some interesting things. Some of them are tolerable. Some of them are just plain downright crazy again, and there's reason for that. So Neil deGrasse Tyson makes this wonderful comment. He says, a great challenge of life, knowing enough to think you're right, but not knowing enough to know that you are wrong. And I think that's something that's you'll see in this document. There are people that know enough to understand trees and to have some views, but not enough to understand risk and the nuances of it. Yeah, see, there we are. There's a HTML link there. You can go and have a look at the current one. I'll give you the current and the old one at the back. The background of the system. The original document was produced in 2014. It was revised in 2021, and it says, this guide is reviewed and presented as version 10.0, fit for purpose. It was written by Arborist for Arborist, TCAA Executive 2021. And again, nothing wrong with that. Interesting that it's gone through 10 revisions. That's pretty good. But how well does the document and the system stack up? And that's the question we need to look at. In the tree risk assessment, most trees are categorized as high, very high, and extreme high. Now, the stuff in blue is direct quotes. So in the 2014 version of this document, the authors believe that most trees are high, very high, or extreme risk. Now, I can debunk that in 2 seconds or 3 seconds. If that was the case, there'd be hundreds of thousands of dead people. There are not hundreds of thousands of dead people, so most trees can't be anywhere near that, unless they mean a high risk is like beds. Beds are a high risk. Oh yeah, don't sleep on your bed tonight. If they mean that's a high risk, well then it's probably accurate. So there's some calibration there, and I think that's just a great honest revelation of how the authors were thinking when they produced the document. You know, we can classify a whole pile of trees high, and then that means a whole pile of work needs to be done. And that's the way I read it. It's there to generate work. A complete inventory can be costly, but it provides the most accurate data, especially on a facility that has lots of trees. Now, that's a true statement. I think that's true, but it has nothing to do with risk. Risk is about finding the trees that pose problems that have a level of risk outside of the level of tolerability of the client, and then just addressing those trees. And I know I've said it before, and I'll say it again, roughly 1 tree in every 5,000 should fall into that risk, the tolerable range, or that 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million. You know, if you look at it from that perspective, that's not most trees. And you know, if a facility had 5,000 trees, that's something like New England University, for example, you know, they would be expecting to be concerned about 1 tree, not most trees. And there'd be no point in keeping the data on the other. Let me be more accurate now, 4,449 other trees just to deal with that 1 tree. You'd deal with that 1 tree. And, you know, 50 or 100 or 200 other trees you've got some maintenance work for. An inventory is not a risk assessment. It's just a real misnomer. In 2014, in New South Wales, Bridget Wright died. The review of that first round of risk assessments, around about half had done an inventory. Why would you do an inventory? Well, it's a lot more work. If it's a lot more work, that means a lot more pay. If it's a lot more pay, well, that's good for us as arborists. But it's not good for trees. So the TCAA system is a 2-part system, and there's a problem with any 2-part system and risk from trees. Apart from those working in it, we'll have a look why that is. So risk rating score is determined after assessing the failure potential and the target rating of an identified hazard tree. So 2 components: how likely is it to fail, and the target rating, how often is the target likely to be there? Well, in the ISA's basic tree risk assessment, which is the track one that is used in track grading, that particular system, that's our first matrix. Then you still have another matrix you've got to put in, which is consequence. This system doesn't have that. So what it produces is a harm from a falling leaf is exactly the same as a harm from a 2-meter diameter tree falling on you. And of course, that's absurd. And The system realizes that it's absurd. It's tried to deal with it in some ways, but that even makes it more absurd. So 2 elements are inserted into a single matrix, and the result output is given ordinally. Ordinally means in the sequence that it goes lower to higher or higher to lower. So extreme risk, high risk, or extreme, very high, high, moderate, low, very low, extremely low, you know, whatever sequence you want. And that's a common process. So in 2014, it was low, medium, high, very high, and extreme. But in the revision, they made some changes. Now it's ALARP, medium, high 1, high, high 2, very high, high 3, extreme. Okay. And you can see that's just really weird. We've now got ALARP, which is not a risk level. It's got you could have a tree that was extreme and was ALARP. Can't think of an example of how you could do that, but I'm sure you could. You've got you definitely could have medium in ALARP and high in ALARP. So ALARP is a wrong choice of words, and we'll talk about that again in a few more minutes. And then 3 levels of high. You know, this goes back to that most trees are high. Well, when 3 out of your 5 outputs are high, boy, that doesn't surprise me. You know, why don't we just make them all high, and then, you know, high 1, high 2, high 3, high 4, high 5. And so this is what your matrix looks like. You've got this wonderful thing of a matrix. This is the 2014 one. Occasional use, intermittent use, frequent use, constant use, and continual use. Now, I get confused with the constant and continual, and I get confused between the constant and frequent. Intermittent, I get. Occasional, I'm not sure whether they're the right way around. These are, is intermittent, you know, less frequent or more frequent than occasional? It's not very clear. I think there are probably better choices. And then down there, failure potential, very likely, likely, somewhat likely, unlikely, and highly unlikely. And they seem okay, but now we've got to try and understand what they mean when they say those words. This is the same system, done all the same with the same roll-on of the T on intermittent. Nobody could figure out how to drop the point down by half a point. You know, it just drives me crazy, but that's okay. And then now we've got the ALARP group in there. Just really weird. So let's have a look at those in a bit more detail. The terms are ordinal, but the duration is ambiguous. We don't know over what time frame. Is it 7 days, 5 years? We're left uncertain. There's nothing that communicates that. It may be in their training, and I've got to tell you, I did try and get into the training before I wrote this. They had lots of spaces. My office called and they said, yeah, plenty of room. What's the participant's name? They said Mark Hartley, and they realized they had a booking mistake and they were full out, so they couldn't fit me in. So I can only do this from what they've published, not from the training. They may say in the training that if it's going to fail in its lifetime, then it's in that category. Very likely is defined, almost certain to occur in most circumstances. Well, if it's almost certain to occur, then it's probably imminent in my mind if you're using the BTRA system. So something in that range. That is, it must be occurring. It must be something that's in the process of happening. Otherwise, why would you say, oh, this is just going to suddenly fail as a tree? It just makes no sense. So very likely, probably imminent. Likely may occur frequently. Now, the problem with may is it may not. It's got both options inferred. As soon as you put in likely, it may occur frequently. It also means that it may not occur frequently. So I'm not any the better. So it could fail within 6 months. They add that in. So, okay, that's now getting really precise, and it's very hard. I've challenged people to do this on a 1-year basis. Send me a photograph of a tree that isn't actively failing and tell me that it's going to fail in 1 year's time. I'll give you odds that you're wrong, and we can make a small little wager, you know, somewhere between $1,000 and $100,000, and I'll win. Because we just don't have that degree of perception. I can't look at a tree and say, well, that's going to fail in the next 12 months, unless I see something that's already so knackered that it's got a problem already. You know, there's a transverse fracture that's opening up. It's cracking up and down the stem and wine barreling. It's rocking in the ground. They I can get right, and I can't get them right all the time. As Sean Tunnett will tell you, when I do assessments, I think, oh yeah, that tree's got some problems. And 15 years later, I'm back there and saying, and it's still got problems. And so, you know, I've got grey boxes. I've got one grey box in the school that I've just given up and taken off the list because it was just didn't budge over 15 years. So somewhat likely is possible and likely. But hang on a second. Likely is possible and may occur frequently. So we've just got a complete circular argument. In other words, likely and somewhat likely are essentially the same terms. So we've got high 1, high 2, high 3, and very likely, likely, and likely. You can see again why they would expect a lot of their assessments to come up with a high input, because trying to get outside of that upper end is difficult. Unlikely. It's not likely to occur. So it's the opposite to likely, but could happen. Yep, again, what phrase? Then it says, it adds in this, it says tree defects are minor and not likely to cause significant harm. Well, whether it causes significant harm or not has no bearing on whether it's likely or unlikely to fail. Now they've started to try and pack in some consequences ambiguously hidden in this phrase. But so if I have something that's unlikely to fail, but it's massive, where do I put it? Well, based on this, I'd have to put it somewhere, what, likely or likely. So I'm back into that, everything going up in the upper categories. Highly unlikely. Thank goodness we've got something. May occur in rare and exceptional circumstances. A healthy tree with no obvious defects. So the vast majority of trees fit into the highly unlikely category. Because let's be honest, if we talk about a small dead branch, I guess if it's a small dead branch, maybe it goes into unlikely. But no, it could fail. Small dead branches have got to go up into somewhat likely. So somewhat likely is likely, and then we go in the nice circular position again. We've just significantly pushed up everything into that category except pristine trees. And again, you can see it's put here, it's quite interesting. Very likely partial or whole tree failure is imminent. We agree. A cavity in excess of 50% of the trunk. And again, I'm not sure on this, they're talking about 50% of what? If it's the area, then they're smarter than I think. If it's the diameter, well, Matic says 65%, not 50%. Inclusions, you've seen, we've got rid of those. Leaning trees, we've got rid of those. Lifting root plate, extensive decay or damage. Again, if I think of something like the tingle tree in Western Australia, you can walk through those. Boy, there must be a lot of people killed in Western Australia under those trees. So they've given you some things, and then the target occupancy is the next one. It's occasional use, intermittent use, frequent, constant, or continual. And now constant use would be an occupied building, but what buildings are used and occupied 100% of the time? Well, a hospital maybe, but how about a church that's used 2 afternoons a week, on a Sunday and on a Wednesday? Is that constant? Or a classroom that's used for 16% of the year? Is that constant occupation? I'm having troubles. Are we talking about the buildings now, or are we talking about the occupants of it? And I think what we're seeing here is the facilities are being talked about. That is the buildings. So constant use is something that's static. Then what's continual use? High voltage power lines, aren't they there all the time as well? So continual and constant are basically the same. So you see again, this process of clustering things in the negative pushes the end results negative almost with everything you do. So let's have a look at some of those. Given as the likelihood of failure and impact, but that is the output, not that is the output of the matrix, sorry. Now they're trying to add consequences in as well. Poorly defined terms cause bracket creep on the user's understandings of the term. And you can go have a look at this. It's an interesting little article that talks about it. I'll give you a little bit of it now. It conflates defect with structural inadequacy. So just because there's a cavity doesn't mean that it's necessarily lost strength. And we talk about this with the flyness paradox, which, by the way, now flyness has been put into a whole new genus in Australia just to mess with you. But yes, this white stem rot problem makes the tree stronger. Yeah, it's got a defect that's resulting in a stronger tree. So we can't just talk about defects, because there's not a correlation between a defect and inadequacy. You can have lots of defects that don't fail. A leaning tree is a classic example. Likely and somewhat likely can't be distinguished from each other. I've said that already, and including consequences in the example demonstrating that the authors have failed to correctly identify and separate the risk elements out. There are 3 risk elements: likelihood of the part failing, likelihood of the target being there, and the consequence of the impact. That's the 3. Very likely whole tree failure is imminent. Cavity 50%, 50% of what? And I'm going to refer to some people here: Bond, Gruber, Talent, Rin, and others. All have attempted to correct this. It should be obvious by now that the TR ratio was meant by Klaus-Mannek to be the time at which you start to think about the impact of the cavity. And you should know by now, hopefully, that 85 centimeters is a threshold at which it starts to become highly unreliable. So if you've got an 85 centimeter diameter trunk, start to be very dubious of those that say, oh, it's the tree's unstable because it's hollow. I don't know why these guys haven't kept up with this sort of stuff, but it's out there. Important that they do. So perhaps share some of this with them. Bark inclusions only if the cracking has started. Talked about that. Oh, we've got toxins in there. Okay, there's 1 death from Dendrocnide moroides in 1894 in Australia. That's the gimpy tree, the stinging tree, the nettle tree. And bees, yep, well, that's true. Bees do kill a lot of people in Australia, 2 people a year, roughly. That's more than sharks. Think about that. That's amazing. So bees are killing 2 people a year. And so I had to ask AI, I said, how many people are stung by bees that have been feeding on blossoms of trees and shrubs? Yeah, you guessed it. She laughed at me. Seriously, that sort of data is not collected, but most trees have their flowers above the ground. So trying to get up and touch the bees or get too close to the bees on trees should be something we just ignore. So I think the other solution is you either get rid of that or get rid of flower and pollen producing plants. So angiosperms and gymnosperms, just cut them all down and die. Because that's what this seems to infer, saving the 2 most stupid people that have got a bee allergy that don't have an EpiPen with them. No, I can't say they deserve to die. They probably don't. Sorry, Kath. The last point demonstrates that the system mixes consequence with likelihood. So the poisoning is a consequence, but it's not how likely it is to happen. So 1 death in 100 years doesn't constitute something that I would consider was highly likely to occur. I think that's fairly unlikely to occur. Likely to happen in the next 6 months. This implies very likely. Will be much sooner than this. Such precision, as I said, is nonsense. Could cause structural failure. This doesn't sound like something that will most likely fail in the next 6 months, but then they go and give it saying that does. Large branch failure doesn't matter because it's not a whole tree. They look at it and say it's whole tree failure that they're worried about, not branch failure, because it doesn't fit in that upper category. And somewhat likely to find it says tree, this is their internal text, tree defects present could cause portions of the tree to fail. So that's somewhat likely. Likely can't have a branch that's likely to fail. It's got to go into somewhat likely. They're just mixing consequence and likelihood of failure together. Target use, terms of oil, again, ambiguous, so ambiguous I get confused on the last 2. I just haven't figured them out, as I said. It's unclear what the differences are in each range, and I know that Arbos has just come up with a system that attempts to deal with it ordinarily and in log 10, and I don't know how well it's doing it. Peter and I are going to have a look at that next week or the week after, I think it is. Constant use is lower than continual use. So I assume continual means all the time, e.g. the buildings, not the occupants. It's unclear. Perhaps it was explained during the training, but as I said, I wasn't there. Occupation by people can be assessed is mixed, in essence is mixed. The risk from a large dead branch, 15 centimeters in diameter, to a person using a seat outside a restaurant is occupied 10% of the time, frequent use, is lower than the risk to a person who's inside a classroom, constant use. Unless we have the building being the concern and the person inside the building essentially being ignored. In which case we're looking at property damage. And how do we weigh property damage and injury to a person unless we come up with a statistical method that allows us to use a value of statistical life? And so the system doesn't do that. So it just, it's a $180,000 relocatable school building. Well, it's worth the same price as a young kid at the school. That doesn't seem intuitively right in my mind to think that seems somehow or other fundamentally flawed. Continual use. Examples of continual use. The document does provide you examples. Emergency services, high voltage power lines, highway, a pathway. Wow, that I've seen very few paths except in retail areas that are used constantly. So again, it's unclear how they're continually used unless it's the actual path. And again, I would hope that a tree falling on and damaging a path is not equated as the same value as a tree falling on and killing a person. I think they should be somewhat different. And how do emergency services and high voltage power lines fit in with use by people seen in other uses? It just, things are mixed all over the place with it. They've somehow or other said, oh, we need to put that in. They've just found a spot and shoved it in. A second set of definitions. Okay, we've got occasional use, out of bounds area, restricted, inducted area. I don't know what an inducted area is. Intermittent use, a parking lot or an oval. Well, the parking lot outside the train station is used at least 50% of the year. That's fairly high. That's not intermittent. The parking lot in the school playground and the school grounds is used about 20% of the time. Again, that's not what I'd call intermittent. Frequent. Busy street, typical schoolyard, childcare centres, gateways. Now, if I think of a typical schoolyard, there are parts that are frequent, but there are a whole pile of out of bounds area that I'm assuming that children aren't usually there, and that'll come down lower on. But, it's already come in, sorry, the first one out of bounds. But how about the oval when they're only playing on there for, a couple of hours a week in a high school, for example, during sports, 3 or 4 hours, maybe with PE, you might get 5 or 6 hours of the use of the oval. That's not what I'd call frequent, but maybe it is. Again, we haven't been given any sort of boundaries. And a good boundary would be something like likely means more likely than not. So somewhere close to that, 1 in 2 and higher. And again, that's just precision garbage. But, if we said 10% of the time or more, I would say, okay, I get what you're saying, but I'm not sure what they're saying. And that's a problem. Continual use has access pathways, assembly areas. So in terms of further condensing these areas, 5 and 4 are considered higher use areas, 3 and 2 are medium use areas, and 1 is low use area. So you can see how they've automatically clustered everything together again. So you've got a low use and a medium use you're going to get to sometimes. Okay, here's the inherent dilemma with the ordinal language, and it's something that I raised with the ISA when they came up with the original BTRA scheme. I said, yep, you can have these charts. They just all need to be log 10. And that's because I'm a maths nerd and I like the concept of log 10. But they're usually poorly defined. They're horribly defined in the BTRA. They're horribly defined in this document. Worse in this document than the BTRA. If you've got a choice between the two, then go to the ISA, get your track qualification, use it, keep away from this document. Parties are comfortable with the familiarity of the terms. That is, we like those things like high, frequent. we think we're saying the same thing, but we're not. Here's what it actually looks like. So this is a document produced by, head's gone dead, the CIA, looking at risk distribution of things like war and things like that. And I think, if I remember, there was about 170 odd participants, something in that range. So not huge numbers, but enough to see. When they said almost certain, some people thought that that just meant 1% or 2%. Others thought it meant 100%. The median on the first range of deviations is about 95%. That is, the bulk of the people thought, oh, around that 95% plus or minus 3 one way, 5 the other way. That's where it sits. When we get to probably, it moves down a hell of a lot. It's probably going to happen. And then we get down to almost no chance. And again, what's almost no chance? If you've got almost no chance of winning Oz Lotto, and it fits somewhere between, well, you've got to take out 0 because 0 can't be right, because there's a chance, almost no chance. So anywhere between 1%, if you've got a 1% chance of winning Oz Lotto this week, who is going to buy an Oz Lotto ticket? Anyone? Yeah, I am, definitely. You know, the reality is your odds of winning it are 1 in 43 million, not 1%, but 0.000, and we've got a few zeros in there. So when we use these words and we say, oh, it's probably not going to happen, we can mean a whole range of things, from almost certainly likely to happen to, you know, almost no chance. So we tend to hide behind the comfort of the familiarities, even though we haven't meant anything. Same when we come up with the end output, high, medium, low. We don't know what they mean, but everyone feels comfortable. Oh, it's a low risk, probably not too much to worry about. It's a high risk, there's a lot to worry about. Well, if I start off with a system that says most trees are going to be high risk, and the risk from most trees sits in the 1 in 10 million or less, that's not a high risk from my mind, not considering that sleeping has a 1 in 420,000 or driving has a 1 in 20,000. You know, they're high risk activities. In fact, they're so extreme in comparison that I'm surprised we are lawfully allowed to drive or sleep in beds. And that's the problem when we get these words that describe things like that. So stupidity is best. By very definition, likelihood is probabilistic. Doesn't matter how you want to go about it. Most likelihoods in this process fall below 1%, yet the language does not account for this. You know, likelihoods go from 100% down to 0.0000000 ad infinitum 1. And certainly lots of things we deal with on a regular basis have 3 or 4 figures past the decimal point. Oops. We assumed that in Australia, and this is just using this last one, I'll just go back there, almost no chance. Almost no chance. I'm going to use it 3 times. Almost no chance of anyone being present under a tree. This is our lowest risk tree that we could have on that scale. Almost no chance of any tree failing. So we're under this tree, almost no chance, and almost no chance of a falling tree hurting the person if it hits them. 400 people would be killed by the lowest risk tree in Australia every year. 400, not 5 amongst all the trees. And if we take the standard deviation, just one standard deviation from the mean, that's a range from 50 deaths a year to 6,250 deaths a year from the lowest risk trees. I mean, how the hell does somebody get that? On this basis, we're missing thousands of deaths every year. Doesn't matter how you go about it, because we haven't gone to the possible and the possible and the possible. It's just mathematical stupidity. What is communicated is not understood, and it's not realistic. Okay, we think we're understanding when you said it was a low risk or a medium risk or a high risk what it was, but it needs to be benchmarked statistically. And so this is what we end up with. You know, somebody who's talking about Peking duck, one of those would be really nice. one of those will end up in jail. It's not good enough that we both think we're talking about the same thing. We actually need to be talking about the same thing. The consequences, I've said, are ignored, and that's a big issue with the system. You can't leave any of the three elements out. Risk is most commonly defined in these terms: likelihood times consequence. Because we're dealing with trees, we've got two likelihoods: likelihood of the part falling and a likelihood of the target being there. And that system's, what it's doing is essentially emulating, as I said, the very first matrix in the track train basic tree risk assessment. So just the first matrix, don't worry about the second matrix, don't need to have it. This system is just going to do one section and half the job, and that's what they're doing. But the document itself defines it this way, and I think this is lovely because there's nothing better than documents that are internally inconsistent. Risk is when it's possible that a hazard tree will actually cause harm. Okay, well, we agree with that. If it can't cause harm, then it's not a risk. The level of risk will depend on factors including occupation of an area, how often and whom uses the area, how serious could injuries and damage cause that are a result from either impacts or poor management. By the way, that's a direct quote, so don't pick on me for the grammar. Okay. So they've acknowledged those three components make it up, but their table doesn't deal with that. You need either two tables like the ASA did, or three inputs somehow or other, whether it be on a app like Valid or whether it be on a calculator like the round wheel of QTRA. Not three inputs, not a valid risk assessment. Ignoring consequences means that a 10mm branch that will fail in the next year poses the same risk as a meter diamond tree they'll fail in the next year. And that's just insanity. There's no logic to that. But it does explain, Sean, why you've gone through schools and removed every 10mm branch. And it's been a priority to do, because if you take away consequences, then the risk can be high. What's the likelihood of a 10mm branch falling? Well, it's more likely than a 100mm branch. It's more likely than a 200mm branch. So you could argue that 10mm branches are greater risk. Yeah, it's a problem. If we use risk equals likelihood times consequence, then the TCAA system determines the likelihood of failure and impact, and not the risk. So it's doing, as I said, half the job. And you can see that in this chart now quite clearly, only two inputs. Although they do, as I say, put some things in their definitions that allow consequences, but you can't have a consequence that's very likely to occur because you don't know what that consequence is. It could be a low consequence, medium consequence, high consequence. So the source of confusion, the publication is good enough that I think I found that. And they went through and most wonderfully said 2018 reviewed, 2019 tree inspection for access and work booklet produced by AA. So they've gone through the best management practice or the minimum industry standard. And it says it uses a matrix likelihood consequences, page 6, to determine the risk rating for tree hazards when working on trees. And here's the truth. They're absolutely right. You can do that because you can't have somebody hurt by trees working on trees if the person's not there. So when they're working on trees, the assumption is the person is there 100% of the time. If the person disappears, then the risk disappears. And they didn't understand that. So they've thought that just because AA had done it in that publication, it would be, or ArborMentor did it in that publication, that's what they should do in theirs. And then they reference the risk management terminology, Safe Work Australia. And again, Safe Work Australia is assuming that the worker is there. Okay, I've never had a tree fall on a worker and kill them if they weren't on site. It's just not possible. And it's, again, it's what happens when you don't grasp what this is all about. And that's why I'm going over it. I think it's great learning. I think it's great that they've given it a go. It's just that it's got a long way to go. By the time they've finished, they'll essentially be replicating the BTRA system or the ISA track system. And I'm guessing at the rate they're going, they're probably about maybe 300 or 400 revisions away from that, because they'll need books to explain things. And even the ISA has, some glaring problems with its system. An assessment for a climber working in a tree is not the same as a person walking past a tree, for the very reason I just explained. Outside working in a tree, many targets are mobile. Sorry, I just got to move this up. Like pedestrians walking past a tree or a car parked under the tree. So need to keep that in mind. A flawed definition of risk. Oh boy. Now we get some weird stuff because we've already got it done right. But risk is when it's possible the hazard will actually cause harm. We've seen that that's got a problem to it, and it's going to create problems. If the risk is impossible, it's not a risk. Likewise, if it can't actually cause harm, it's not a risk. So they've just used a circular argument to essentially argue the same position again. It's unclear what TCAA method is using, but it's just taking guesses. Again, we see the end output, and that's great. They've got some end outputs, extreme high 3. You guys should be familiar now that they've got 3 of those or 4 of those that are going to come together. Well, extreme high, we can read that, serious personal injury or death, high value property damage or major disruption. That's good. So that varies from high risk because it's got serious personal injury or death, high value property damage or major disruption. Can anyone tell me the difference? I can tell you, this one is missing a full stop. Okay. Apart from that, they're identical definitions. So let's just put it into the one category. Good thing is control measures may require isolating a tree initially until the work can be complete. That's good. High, it's substantial personal injury, moderate to high value property damage. Again, I don't know what moderate to high value property damage is and how you're comparing that with a person. So there may be needs to have some thoughts about that. And there are lots of ways that that's been done in literature on risk. Again, it would suggest that these guys probably haven't read a textbook on risk and risk assessment. Then we've got medium, minor personal injury. Now, minor, I'm assuming that maybe is a trip down to the doctors to get a few stitches. You know, that's probably about the worst that you would expect. Minor personal injury, low to moderate value property damage. Again, not sure how minor personal injury relates to that, or small disruption in the activities. So, you know, the tree's fallen on the road and it'll take 15 minutes for SES to get there. And now we have a control measure for something that low. And here's the control measure. Control measures may be required isolating a tree initially until work can be completed. It seems to be that may be the same for the rest. So all of those require something. Now, ALARP, and we'll talk about why ALARP's an issue in a second, no personal injury, low value property damage. So if you get a hit and you bleed and they put a Band-Aid on you, that must be a medium risk tree, because no personal injury is acceptable in this range. That means, for example, in my office, a paper cut would be a medium risk. Now, that just, again, doesn't gel up. So no personal injury, low value property damage, or disruptions that can be replaced or, and I can't see what the rest of that one is, sorry, hide, or repaired. Oh, so if you break a copper pipe, that's property damage, because the only way you can repair something is if it's property. I don't want to let him know that, but you can figure out that's a logical conclusion. If you can repair it, it must be property. You cannot repair a disruption. The disruption happens until it's resolved. And now you need minimal control measures required. So every tree needs some form of control measure. Again, they did tell you up front, they think that most trees are dangerous. The problem with ALARP is it's not a risk output. It's a weighing up of the risk against the seriousness of the consequence, the resources available, and the solutions that are available. So you could have a medium risk tree that was ALARP, a high risk tree that was ALARP. You could have a low risk tree that was ALARP, but you can't have it ALARP to start off with. Risk is determined, then consequences considered. And we've got extreme, very high, have the same consequences and therefore are identical. Extreme, very high, and moderate work or require the same control measures, isolating a tree initially until the work can be completed. Grammar corrected. I apologize for doing that. What's the difference between death and serious personal injury? I don't know. What's serious personal injury? Not defined. It's not defined, by the way, in the BTRA as well. It's one of the issues that has. What's the difference between serious personal injury and substantial personal injury? Are we saying death and a broken neck? Well, boy, in my mind, a broken neck and death are much the same. So how do we separate those out? It doesn't seem like they've considered grouping some of those things that are naturally grouped. Permanent, significant disability and death, in some ways, death is a better option. And minor personal injury, we don't know where they are. They're not defined. And it's a problem that risk systems have. They don't want to put definitions to them because then they're actually trying to communicate something concrete. And we communicate something concrete, then we may not agree with each other anymore. And that's one of the advantages of the quantitative system. Valid QTR, we don't have to agree. We just have to know where each party's coming from, what they're putting in. This, I can put in 3 alternatives or 3 outputs, my favorite 3 outputs: yellow, slippery, wet. Yellow is a bigger risk than slippery. Slippery is a bigger risk than wet. And if I said to somebody, oh, this is a wet risk, they'll say, well, what the hell does that mean? Well, about the same as low. What the hell does that mean? And that's the issue. The only one that's not ambiguous is death. We get what death is, that's an absolute. And that's one of the reasons I'll often talk in terms of death, is because it avoids so much confusion. At least 3 systems exist that are much better defined. That's your track BTRA system, valid, and QTR. All of them do a lot better job of defining that process. More critically, the consequences have been added to the end risk output. You can't determine the risk and then add the consequence. Can you have a low likelihood of failure and impact resulting in death? Of course you can, but not in their system. And that risk will be lower than almost certain likelihood of, say, a broken branch falling and hitting someone and resulting in significant injury, a broken bone. So they've just not thought about the process. When you add the consequence at the end, you're not truly calculating the risk. So there's the problem. We have the LRP in the room. LRP is not a risk rating. It's a part of the tolerability risk framework. You can apply it in qualitative terms, but it's not ideal. I remember when I first started using log 10 for my risk assessments, which was before I sold the business, so 2002, I used to have safety officers say, but you can't have the risk in log 10. And I would say, not only can you, it is actually in log 10. Doesn't matter how you do it. It's a logarithmic curve. And for those of you who don't know, a logarithmic curve is one that starts very low and rapidly rises up. And in this case, it starts big and it rapidly falls down. Risk drops down significantly. It is an assessment of tolerable or other identified risks to determine if mitigation of the risk is reasonable and proportionate. You could have a tree that poses an elevated risk compared with other trees that are still LRP. And I can think of a tree I've got in the Schofields area. It's a 1 in 50,000 based on QTRA. And the tree is of value and the health benefits that it provides overweighs that risk. And so keep it there. Leave the tree. Now, remember that driving is 1 in 20,000 risk of death. So 1 in 50,000, it's still a reasonable risk. We'd like it to drop down more, but in the end, the council, rather than planting out underneath the tree, put a fence up, and that's fine. That's their choice. The system does not consider the benefits provided by the tree, and that's something that I got in a lot of trouble for in the earlier days with Mike Ellison from QTRA. I was saying, there needs to be a risk-benefit analysis. 3 of us published an authored an article in the Journal of Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, and several criticisms were: one is it wasn't a risk-benefit assessment of the Lehman Street trees. That is, the risk was far outweighed by the trees, the benefits they provided. And so you have that as one problem. And the second problem you get then is you're not truly looking at where the real risk falls. And I've said it many a times, if the tree is healthy, in most cases, the greatest risk will arise from removing the tree unless it's actively failing. So target types, again, we get some useful information here. I love useful information. We've got stationary things. They're buildings, classroom, residence offices, fixed infrastructure, concrete paths. Well, we already know they're heavily used, bridges, and we've got all these things. We've got seated areas. I think the seated areas are stationary. Emergency gathering areas, they're probably not so stationary. You probably don't need to move any infrastructure. You just move a sign and say here. So it's not stationary. The people that are using it aren't stationary. Educational gathering areas, the same thing. So I think they've mixed up their terms. Mobile, we've got people, fauna, livestock associated with occupation, vehicles. That's good. Mobile infrastructure, we've got dams. Now, I know that most of you have seen dams running down the road at some stage or other, but damn if I have. Fences and gates, really. Water, utility, power cables, they're all mobile. They move. I don't know what happened at this point in time. I'm hoping it was nefarious substances and not that someone was dropped on their head as a child, but it's starting to look suspicious to me. Obviously, I've said it, stationary, educational gathering areas, emergency gathering areas, seated areas, they're not stationary. They're just areas. Sure, the area is not going to move. And last time a big tree fell on an emergency gathering area with nobody present, no one was killed. Sean, tell us, stop laughing your head off. Then we've got mobile infrastructure, and that's equally as important, mobile and mobile infrastructure, fauna, dams. You know, okay, I get fauna moves around. Dams, gates, water and utilities, power, not the case. So my view is don't use big words. Don't use words you don't understand, like mobile. Transient's the next word, the same table. This is the bottom half of it. We've got transient. Now, transient means come and go. Not there all the time. So some of the things that are transient and low, non-urban gardens, turfed areas, out of bounds areas, restricted areas. No, I don't get that at all. Parking lots are moderately transient. You don't see them move around very often. Sean, stop laughing. You don't see them move around very often, but every now and again you see a parking lot going down the road to a new spot. So it's clear that there was a problem in their understanding of that word. So transient misnomer, risk assessment. Transient means the target is temporary moving or present only occasionally, and that's clearly not what they're using it for. I don't know what it means. The table uses transient to describe fixed geographical assets like riparian patches, urban gardens, and non-urban gardens. A riparian corridor urban garden can't move. I'm sorry, I know I've been told it's transient, but you just got to trust me, they don't. So don't use big words to make you look photosynthesis, my answer to that one. If you don't know what the word means and it sounds like it's good, at least look it up. There's some free dictionaries online and they cost you nothing. Just search transient meaning and it'll come up. It's scary, and arborists do this all the time. We come across a word. I've got a fairly good vocabulary and I'm regularly checking to make sure that the word I've used means precisely what I want it to mean, not something that's misunderstood. My daughter tells me all the time she could beat people up for using the word penultimate. It's the penultimate handbag. Well, that means it's the second in line. People use it constantly as it's the ultimate, but penultimate means ultimate but one. So have problems there. Yes, likely is equal to likely, but not very likely. Let's have a look at that. We've got a section in the document that talks about elevated hazards. These elevated hazards are the things we need to be worrying about the most. These trees have defects that make them likely or somewhat likely to fail. And we said there's already, that's already a circular argument, or expose a person or property to damage. I'm hoping that not too many people are damaged. When such trees identified, the Tree Management Guidelines 2021, Tree Contractors Association of Australia 5 high use area, the extent of risk is categorised as very likely or somewhat likely to fail. Well, hang on, it's just gone 3 ranges in one definition. So all those 3 ranges from very likely to somewhat likely, as I asserted earlier, are essentially in the author's mind the same. They don't differ. Risk is not the same as likelihood of failure. Likelihood of failure, one of 3 inputs, and only one of 3 inputs. People and property are not equal. You've got to find some way of doing that. The most standard way is to come up with a thing called the value of statistical life. In Australia, the Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet publish that each year. I think this year it's about 5.6 million, somewhere around there. If you want to understand the logic behind it, there's a wonderful thesis that goes with it. You can read it. I found it riveting reading. I found it interesting to see how other countries had influenced ours. And the end conclusion of that was the human being at that time was worth $5 million. It's gone up by inflation. It's probably gone up by inflation faster than our tax rates will go up, but don't hold the government against that. The increase is one that ideally the author would have said was about 72 million, and his conclusion was if we valued life at where it probably should truly be valued at 72 million, we'd go bankrupt. We can't afford to do it. So definitely worth the look at the government's value of statistical life. Lesser hazards, well, they're trees are unlikely or highly unlikely to fail or cause harm except in high use areas. Yes, when they're in high use areas, they're very likely and likely to fail. You just move the same problem. So a dead tree rocking in the ground, an ordinary tree that's not got an issue, a dead tree that's solid, you move it into those high risk areas and all of a sudden it becomes a lot more likely to fail. It makes no sense at all. The target doesn't alter the likelihood of failure. It's just an erroneous concept. And again, displays the lack of understanding of the parties involved. So where there's an elevated hazard or lesser hazard in high use areas, the tree is to be removed rather than the risk being mitigated. That makes no sense. You can't mitigate, in their view, trees in that situation. My choice would be to mitigate if that was the most cost-effective and beneficial end result, which is why you need to go through this ALARP process. Because they don't understand ALARP, that's ignored altogether. Stick to science. This is a lovely little quote from it. I love it. By the way, all the stuff in blue is their quotes. Observe trees early in the morning, as evidence of branch drop is more probable when plant cells are turgid. Actually, that's not true. Evidence of fallen branches is more obvious when your eyes are open. So don't do it when you're sleeping. You cannot tell that a branch is going to drop. And I'm prepared to gamble here. Anyone that sees this and says to me, yes, I can tell where the next summer branch drop is going to be from on a perfectly normal branch, I'm happy to give you $100,000 for your 1,000. Just tell me and I'll come and collect the $1,000. That's just absurd. I've seen summer branch drop. I've experienced it several times, but I can't figure it out by walking around saying, oh, look at that branch. It's very turgid. It just is nonsensical. It's obvious anytime there's a fallen branch, what they're suggesting is that these guys can somehow or other walk around and predict it. In fact, this is instructions for facility managers. So they're saying that an untrained, not even an arborist, can walk around and say, oh yeah, look, that branch is getting higher and higher and higher very rapidly. It's ready to break any second now. Certain trees are habitat to venomous animals like spiders, including a tree funnel web, Atrax robustus. Now, this is just unfortunate. It's unfortunate because as a kid, the Australian government would offer $10 reward for collecting funnel web spiders, a perfect thing to get a 12-year-old into a wonderful habit of going out and collecting them. So I fell in love with these. I actually had preserved ones in my bedroom, got into trouble for taking them to school. When you take a preserved one out, it looks damn scary. And I thought they were wonderful creatures. But Atrax robustus is a Sydney funnel-web spider, and it lives in the ground. The funnel-web spider that he was thinking about used to be called Atrax formidabilis. It's now Hydronicum formidabilis. They're somewhat related. They're primitive spiders. But, you know, if you're going to write something that's outside of your field of expertise, I picked this up not because I'm an expert, because I'm an enthusiast of spiders. This guy has written about spiders and doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, we get better. Lichens that grow on trees would require to be avoided. A cyanobacteria, surprisingly toxic, causing liver damage. Yellow lichen high in volcanic acid. Now, he's right, it is high in volcanic acid. And that was used to poison wolves. You'd collect large amounts, mix it. You won't eat a yellow lichen. You can try it if you want. Just a little bit of a chew won't kill you. You will hate it because it's horribly bitter. Okay, as most alkaloids are. You just don't want to eat it. So no, you don't need to go spraying off all the lichens on trees. But Sean, hopefully that helps you understand why you see work orders that say spray off and kill the lichen. Lichens are beneficial symbiotes. They're not adverse at all. They're good indicators of environmental conditions. So again, somebody's read volcanic acid and said, wow, this is great stuff, and they're wrong. So again, make sure that you spend time researching the stuff you write about. Will you make mistakes? Yes, but try and avoid it. And this just, again, makes the whole document look amateurish. Get it wrong? Oh, AS 4970 2009 states 200 millimeters can affect tree roots negatively in some species. If anyone can show me where that is in the standard, I would like to know. Now, I don't know much about that standard. I sit as chair of the committee, but that's definitely not in the 2009 standard. It's definitely not in the 2025 standard. That is what you call fabricated. Okay? If you think something says something and you're not overly experienced, or you have troubles reading, or you have difficulties tying up your shoelaces, look it up. Don't go writing it and making yourself look like an idiot. That was just so easy to spot again. Don't make crap up. Okay, and to be fair, I'll give $10,000 to the TCAA to promote their thing if they can find that for me in the Australian standard. Just because I don't want to be an idiot, I went back and did a PDF search, so I know that it's not at all. In the new standard, we just recommend between 10 and 20 centimeters of mulch, which is 200 mils, and we recommend that. So we don't say it can affect some trees negatively. We've gone the opposite. Tree risk and lightning and arborist guide. Well, that was something that was useful and it was challenging, and I had to go back and check some of my stuff. And indeed, some of the things I've said about lightning are wrong, and I'm learning all the time, so that's great. And I stand corrected. Whilst the pressure wave is the primary cause of damage, the heating of the tissue can be a secondary cause of damage. So for that, it creates and gives credit to Hezbollah Crossing, technical writer from Macardle Consultancy. He's got a Bachelor of Biodiversity Science Honours, Macquarie University, assisted in writing the lightning strike article. Well, that's nice, except don't steal. It's complete plagiarization from the December 2021 Arbor Age that was written by John Lully, and he's not even given credit in the entire document. So they've used the document and actually ascribed it to a completely different author. Again, be aware. I know that you can sometimes put something in a file and think, oh, but they should know. Now, I don't know whether I'm assuming Hepzibah Crossing is a male. You know, if you're going to leave someone to do a job, you still need to be checking it. Oh, got to go over that thing again. Don't misrepresent your qualifications. One of the guys that's been really instrumental in the risk matrix process is a guy called Bill Sullivan. And we get told that a special permission for use of the Matrix Visual Tree Risk Management System, copyright 2015 from Bill Sullivan, AQF level 6. Wow. AQF level 6. I get that. I know what that is. That's an advanced diploma. And I wish I could have one in arboriculture, but I don't. In 2009, the coroner states of Mr. Sullivan that he has an advanced diploma level 6 in horticulture and tropical arboriculture from Charles Sturt Darwin University. And that's impressive. So I thought I'd like to get that qualification. So I called Charles Sturt University and I said, do you offer this qualification? They said, no. I said, have you ever offered this qualification? They said, nope. Now, that causes me great concern when someone has to lie to the coroner's court. Really causes me concern. Charles Sturt University or any other RTO has never offered the qualification. An advanced diploma in horticulture or arboriculture, AQF level 6, was not offered until 2016. I know, I was education chair that brought that process into being. So 2009, when he made that statement that he had that qualification, neither of those qualifications even existed. Again, the glaring lights that people put up there. Tree Contractors Association, I've given you what it's from. That's the version I've used. And they talk about things that are important. Experience. Well, I've seen the experience. It's falsified, but it's there. And trust. A lot of Charles Darwin Union, not Charles Sturt. Thank you. I don't know where I got Charles Sturt from. Thank you. That's the thing. You can see how easy it is to pick a system like that apart with just a little bit of knowledge. And it's why when you want to do something like that, you've really got to delve into the science behind it. There are some great publications on risk, some fantastic books. And just to give you an idea, Mike Ellison's still studying it. David Evans is still studying it. David and I regularly talk about how risk is being handled in different areas. So don't just think that anyone can go and, well, don't think that any idiot can go and write a true risk assessment system. But I think there's some proof that some can. It's just that it's not a good one. Any questions on that?
I know you've been over this before, but just go over where again really quickly how you get the you times your likelihood by the probability of a statistical life to get your values.
Oh yeah, okay. So if we've got a 1 in a million chance of something causing a harm, death, and the life is worth 5.6 million, then 1/millionth of 5.6 million is $5.60. That means you've got $5.60 a year to do something with. So if it's pruning a tree, Peter, I'm hoping that you'll prune my trees for $56 a piece. But if it's more than that, then it would be disproportionate. We go down to 100,000. I've now got 10 times more. So now I've got $560. Well, $560 might get me to removing the larger dead branches. It might not. And if it doesn't, because, you know, it's over a road and now we need traffic control, that's an $1,800 job just to start off with. It's still grossly disproportionate to the risk. The lesser harm would be taking that money and putting it into something that's higher risk. And I will tell all of you that the highest risk activity, and please somebody at some stage tell me you've listened and you've done it, the highest risk activity that we consultants do is drive. Advanced driving courses for every consultant should be mandatory, including me. And they'll tell me I'm not allowed to play chess whilst driving anymore. I'm not allowed to play Pokemon whilst driving, and I don't want to hear it, so I'm not going to do one. But the reality is that is the highest risk component that we do. That and walking whilst we're looking at trees. My SWIMS document for consultancy says don't walk or take photographs and walk whilst looking at trees. Don't take photographs and walk. And don't walk and look at the trees. Stay stationary. And how often do I walk and look? All the time, because I'm still 65. I'm not going to be the high risk group yet. Another 10 years time, tripping over and breaking a major bone is going to be a big issue, although my bone density is excellent. That's because I carry all that extra heavy weight all the time. So maybe having a little bit of excess fat's not all that bad. Does that help you answer your question, Peter? And that's why coming up with a statistical answer is nice, because now I can compare it. And it's interesting, The same thing happens with traffic lights. Traffic engineers say, if we're going to put this light in and it's going to cost us $1.2 million, we've got to save our life every 5 years. Otherwise, it's disproportionate. Okay. The government says, oh, we're not going to give Ozempic to every person that's obese because, well, okay, they've got a high death rate, but it's really not that high. But we'll give it to all type 2 and type 1 diabetes that want to use it, type 2 diabetes that want to use it. And we'll do that for $9. So my wife gets it for $9.50 and I get it for $480. Okay, same with playing with your poo. You get that little kit in the mail when you get your poo, you're getting close to it. When you get to play with your poo to see if you've got bowel cancer. When you get to 74, they say, look, you haven't got it yet. And you're getting old to operate on. And hell, you've had a good life anyhow, so you probably deserve to die. We're not going to do it anymore. And you can go down to your chemist and buy them for $35 and get them done. The government says at that point, at 74, you are not worth spending that $35 on. So these decisions are made constantly. We just don't think about it. And so that's one of the lovely things about quantifying risk. Is it precise? I want to make clear that TRAC has its issues, QTRA has its issues, the BTRA, TRAC 1 has its issues, but it's about reducing uncertainty. That document that I just went through just creates more uncertainty. I have no idea at the end of it of anything except that I need to go have a Panadol now and a whole pile of Coca-Cola to try and kill the pain, because it just doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't make sense. It's not that they've intended that. As I said, I give them full marks for giving it a go, but you've got to stick within your abilities. I am not going to try and land a 747 or you're on an A380 tonight, A330 tonight, Sean. I won't attempt to land that plane because that would be catastrophic. And you know, I've caught lots of planes. I've caught lots of A330s. Caught lots of. You're in the back of the plane. That's a horrible spot to be, Sean. But I've caught lots of them, and I'm not going to run up to the guy in the flight deck and say, "Hey, look, I've been on one of these things now, 120 times. I'm going to tell you how to land it." And that's essentially what that document is. It's a document that goes to people that are risk competent and attempts to tell them what to do. And hopefully, within that organization, I think they've got 10 or 12 consultants. Hopefully at some stage, one of them will put their hand up and say, hang on a second, this is so far off the mark, it needs a lot more work. And as I said, by the time they've finished getting it into order, it'll be very much like the BTRA or the TRAC system. It's qualitative. And people ask me why I'm so supportive of that. I think it's a wonderful tool for the average arborist to use to identify trees that are moderate, high, or extreme risk. If they're moderate, high, extreme, they're extreme, isolate. If they're moderate or high, have an AQF level 5 arborist with qualifications that are quantitative, go out and assess the risk and tell you where it actually sits. Yes, it might be elevated, but elevated may still be in the broadly acceptable range. It could be in the tolerable range. Your likelihood of seeing a tree that needs something like the urgent treatment is about 1 in 500,000. It's pretty small odd each year. I haven't seen one in a long, long time. Any other questions? Hopefully that was useful just to let you think about how you can critique, because you will see lots of them out there. This is not the only one. There's a major tree risk company that has its own system. They just don't consider occupation as a thing because, again, they use a standard matrix. Anytime you see one single standard matrix, alarm bell should be going off. You should be saying, hang on a second, this cannot be a proper tree risk assessment because it's got to assume one of those components 100%.
I don't know why they'd write it in the first place. That's what I'm getting at. Because that way they don't have to look like they're a part of something else. That way they can be seen as the experts. I've heard two wonderful quotes. One of them was, no, you should be coming to us as consultants because we're the experts. We do the whole lot, climb and everything. Well, I'm not sure that Klaus Matic or Alex Shiger would have agreed with them on that. I think your education matters far more than how much time you spend climbing a tree. Climbing a tree is of great benefit. I'm not I think it's a wonderful thing to have had, but it's only a benefit. It's not what sets the process apart. The other one was a particular gentleman walked into a training day once, and he was asked just to explain who he is, and he sat at the desk and he said, "I'm a third generation arborist, and there's nothing you can tell me about trees I don't already know." That's a very arrogant comment. The presenter was David Evans, and David quickly came back with, "Oh, I didn't know arboriculture knowledge was genetically inheritable." And I thought, what a quick line comeback. You know, that very comment is the exact Neil deGrasse issue that I was talking about at the beginning. You know enough to think you're right, but you don't know enough to know that you're wrong. And I heard that very same arborist telling me how termites fly around, they land in the tree and they bury down through the tree to the bottom of the tree. And I heard his father talking about copra beetle and turpentines. Well, copra beetle is a corpse or flesh-eating beetle, and his view was that's why turpentines aren't eaten by copra beetle, because they've got all these chemicals. Of course, they're not eaten by a beetle at all. They're used in marine pilings, and yes, their extractives or the chemicals in them make them resistant to marine organisms, not flesh-eating beetles. Thank goodness. If we had flesh-eating beetles eating trees, we'd have a different world. Any other questions? Okay, guys. Well, hopefully that's of some use. It's out there. Share it around. Thanks, Michael. And again, it's a good reminder to every other organisation, be very careful. The work that's required to produce one of these. ISA spent a decade trying to do what they've done, and it's easy enough for me still to go through that document and pull holes out of it. You know, and it's not that it's not a great attempt and it's not a great starting point. I think it really is, and I mean that sincerely. I think, you know, I'd encourage everyone to have the track qualification and keep it current. But pick yourself either the valid or the TCAA system for quantifying, so that you actually can make a decision. Is this really something that we can do something with, or is it just not? And again, both systems. David's done with his app, done a great job of trying to calibrate people better. Something I really like. Mike's done a great job of making everything open and you can have a look at it. So hopefully that helps you all in doing that risk assessment process and helps you become aware of silly things we all say all the time. I do it, you know. Oh, the risk of that branch failing. No, it's the likelihood of that branch failing, you know. That's just a common misuse of the word risk. Well, it's sort of a correct use because we're talking about the consequence being the falling branch, but the correct word would be likelihood.
Thank you.
You're welcome, guys.